stars were wrong above Kheled Station, not misaligned, hungry. They pressed too close to the sky, bulging like blind eyes behind a thin membrane of night. And every astronomer on the colony felt it in their teeth before the alarms ever sounded. When the first scream came through the comms, it did not end where breath should end. It stretched, folded back on itself, learned new shapes. That was when the espatiers landed. 8 drop coffins screamed through burning air, punching craters into soil never meant to know war. 8 Terrans rose from the smoke, visors black, armor scarred before the fighting even began, rifles humming with the low prayer of charged coils. They saw the swarm. It was not a thing so much as a decision. A tide of limbs that did not repeat. Angles that could not exist twice. Teeth that opened sideways into colors with no names. It flowed between buildings like rot through bone, and where it passed, the rules followed behind it, limping. The evacuation clocks began to tick. 8 minutes to clear the inner shelters, 12 for the orbital lifts, longer than anyone could buy. Espatiers came the order, thin with static and dread, delay at all costs. They answered as Terrans always do. Copy. The first to fall was Harker, who laughed when the swarm learned how to scream back. He planted himself at a junction where 3 streets died, shoulder braced against broken ferrocrete, and fired until the barrels glowed white hot, until the recoil broke bones, and he fired anyway. The swarm learned his name. It wore his voice for a moment. Then it tore him into shapes that no longer needed names at all. The clock ticked on. Vasquez went next, dragging civilians into a shelter with one arm, while holding a plasma cutter in the other, burning sigils into flesh that should not burn. She died standing in the doorway, armor fused to the frame, body a barricade that refused to be moved, until the last child was sealed inside. Something ancient recoiled from her corpse, confused by the idea of defiance. Ada whispered prayers not to gods, but to engineers long dead, overcharging his suit reactor until reality itself protested. When he detonated, the blast tore a hole in the swarm, wide enough for hope to crawl through on bleeding hands. The sky flinched. Kowalski held the stairwell alone, counting heartbeats instead of ammo, marking progress not in meters but in seconds stolen. When the swarm finally reached him, it hesitated, not from fear, from recognition. Something in the dark understood too late that this man would not break. Singh and Miller died together, back to back in a transit hub, flooded with shadows that crawled upward, firing until the shadows learned how to duck. Their last words were not brave. They were practical. Timer still running? Yeah. Good. Osei was the 7th. He broadcast his helmet feed to the evac fleet above, so the civilians could see what was being held back for them. He wanted them to know that the dark could bleed. The signal ended when the sworn learned how to reach inside a man without opening him. The eighth stood alone, no name left, just a cracked visor reflecting a sky that had begun to retreat. They had held long enough. The last espatier planted the banner, a scrap of Terran fabric burned and patched and stained into ground that screamed when pierced. The swarm surged. The espatier did not retreat. They fired once more, not at the swarm, but into the ground beneath it. The charges collapsed the streets, burying nightmare under rubble and fire and screaming geometry. In the final seconds. Above, the last evac ship broke atmosphere. The stars pulled back. They remembered restraint. Later, when the survivors rebuilt, they would say the swarm withdrew on its own, that it lost interest, that it was never truly beaten. They were correct, but the dark learned something it had not known before, that when humanity stands in its path, the cost is never zero. And sometimes, sometimes, 8 lives are enough to teach the abyss to hesitate.